Hello and welcome to today's webinar in Knowledge Miles. Those are the lectures associated with the 695th Lord Mayor of London. This series sort of addresses connections in and around the square mile, what the current Lord Mayor Michael Magnelli calls the world's coffee house, hence the name for the series. In particular, how those connections might help us tackle future global challenges. And today's lecture has a sort of magic name in it, Shackleton, which always sort of conjures up all sorts of excitement in England anyway, and probably the world. The lecture is called In the Footsteps of Shackleton, the next chapter of the endurance story, and it's presented by Alison Neal, MBE. My name is Richard Harvey. I'll be convening the session today, moderating the Q&A. If you're curious, I'm a professor of computer science at the University of East Anglia. I'm a former Gresham College professor, hence the connection with the City of London. Now then, before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. The agenda today is very simple. This is the intro. Then we're going to hand over to Alison, who's the main feature, and then we're going to take questions. And you're very welcome, and in fact, encouraged to type your questions into the question box, and I will deal with them as they come. So without any further palaver, let me introduce the speaker for today's lecture, who is Alison Neal, MBE. I know why she got her MBE, and I think it will probably come up in her presentation. A very, very noble and intriguing project. She is the CEO of the South Georgia Heritage Trust, and before that she had a background in software, so must be a good person. Right, we have strict rules in these seminars. The first one is that we don't give much of an introduction to our speakers, however distinguished they are, and the second one is that the chairman should jolly well shut up as quickly as possible, because it's all about the speaker. Alison, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Harvey, and everyone who's listening to the Knowledge Miles webinar today. As Richard has said, I'm Alison Neal, the CEO of the South Georgia Heritage Trust, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today about the famous explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton and his connection to the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia. Now, I should say I'm not a historian, or nor am I a Shackleton expert, but I want to share why Shackleton inspires us at the South Georgia Heritage Trust, and why we feel his legacy and South Georgia's connection to the endurance story should be preserved. Next slide, please. Sir Ernest Shackleton took part in 4 expeditions during what is now known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, 3 of which he led. Shackleton is one of the great names of polar history, but do his achievements as an explorer actually match his fame? And if not, then why is he so famous? Next slide, please. He first went south on the British National Antarctic or Discovery Expedition, 1901 to 1904, as Captain Scott's 3rd officer, and this was the start of an often tense relationship. After a failed attempt by Scott, Shackleton and Edward Wilson to reach the South Pole, Shackleton collapsed on the return journey and was subsequently sent home by Scott, despite Shackleton's protestations. He felt that his physical failure had created a stigma that he was determined to overcome, and this was only heightened by references to the incident in Scott's publication, The Voyage of the Discovery. Next slide, please. Shackleton then decided to lead his own expedition, named the British Antarctic or Nimrod Expedition. In 1909, Shackleton and his 3 companions achieved a new furthest south record, reaching 82 degrees south, just 97 miles short of the South Pole. But supplies were running out, and Shackleton took the heartbreaking decision to turn back, with the pole and a place in history tantalisingly within reach. They could have got there in as little as 10 days. This was the first notable occasion where Shackleton demonstrated that he placed the welfare of his men above personal glory. One of his colleagues on the polar plateau that day, calculated that delaying the return by just 1 hour would have resulted in the deaths of all 4 men. Shackleton later wrote to his wife Emily, "I thought you'd rather have a live donkey than a dead lion." At one stage, his deputy Wild suffered a severe bout of dysentery, and the only food he could keep down was dry biscuits. Although supplies had run out, Shackleton had kept 1 or 2 in his pocket for breakfast, and generously gave his last remaining biscuit to the gaunt Wild. When he protested, Shackleton threatened to throw the biscuit away if Wild didn't eat it. Wild wrote in his journal, underlining every word, "Shackleton privately forced upon me his 1 breakfast biscuit, and would have given me another tonight had I allowed him. I do not suppose that anyone else in the world can thoroughly realise how much generosity and sympathy was shown by this. I do. By God, I shall never forget it. Thousands of pounds would not have bought that biscuit." Shackleton was knighted on his return to Britain and dined out on the glory of his achievement for a couple of years, until it was trumped by Amundsen reaching the South Pole in 1911. Next slide, please. Shackleton needed a new challenge and a new first to aim for. His ambition was to cross the White Continent from the Weddell Sea via the South Pole to the Ross Sea. In parallel, a Ross Sea party would travel to the opposite side of the continent, establish camp, and lay supply depots between the Ross Sea coast and Mount Hope. These depots would be necessary for Shackleton and his men to cross the continent from the direction of the Weddell Sea coast via the pole. Shackleton named his latest expedition the Imperial Trans-Antarctic, or as we know it, Endurance Expedition. Endurance, with 28 crew on board, 1 a stowaway, set sail from Plymouth in 1914, bound for Antarctica via Argentina and the island of South Georgia. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Situated in the South Atlantic Ocean, 900 miles east of the Falkland Islands. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? It's still an adventure to get to South Georgia even today. The only way to reach the island is by sea, usually a 4 or 5 day voyage from the Falkland Islands or South America. With its snow and icy landscapes, the island is like a slice of the Alps dropped in the ocean. The light is exceptional and the abundant wildlife amazing, home to whales, seals, and an astonishing 60 million seabirds, including globally important breeding grounds for several species of penguin and albatross. It's definitely one of the favourite places for Sir David Attenborough's documentaries. Back in 1914, there were several whaling stations operating on the island, and Shackleton and his men spent some weeks there preparing for their attempt and gathering information about sea conditions from the whalers, most of which Shackleton promptly ignored. Next slide, please. The Endurance and its crew headed south on December the 5th, but en route in the Weddell Sea, the ship became trapped in the pack ice and drifted north with the ice throughout the Antarctic winter of 1915. The crew survived on Endurance for 10 months until finally it was crushed by the ice and began to break apart. They were forced to abandon ship and set up camp on the frozen sea around them. Next slide, please. Shackleton and his men began desperate measures to save themselves by hauling boats and stores across the ice. Each man was allowed to keep just 2 pounds of personal gear. Setting a good example, Shackleton discarded what at other times might be judged his most valuable and precious belongings, gold coins, and the Bible presented to him by Queen Alexandra. He tore some pages from the Bible before he left it, the flyleaf with the Queen's inscription, the 23rd Psalm, and a verse from the book of Job. Out of whose tomb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Then he deliberately laid the Bible in the snow and walked away. Next slide, please. The Endurance finally sank into the Weddell Sea on November 21st, 1915. The ice the crew were surviving on drifted north and began to break up, but they could see distant mountains, and Shackleton took the decision to launch the lifeboats and sail north to Elephant Island. Ravaged with sickness and exhaustion, they battled through ice-cold spray and choppy seas, making land 6 days later. It was the first time any of them had been on dry land for 497 days. From there, after a period of recuperation, one of the ship's lifeboats, the James Caird, was repurposed in a desperate plan to sail to South Georgia for help. The James Caird was nothing more than an open wooden boat with oars and a sail, which had to make it through 800 miles of the furious 50s, water thick with ice and buffeted by storms, to the south coast of the island of South Georgia. Despite knowing their chances of salvation were slim, 6 of the crew, including Shackleton, decided to make the 17-day voyage. The voyage on the James Caird lifeboat remains one of the most extraordinary small boat journeys in history. Everyone who has encountered the Southern Ocean, even aboard a modern-day vessel, marvels at the steel of the men who made that voyage. Next slide, please. But when they arrived at South Georgia, their troubles weren't over, because the whaling stations and all hope of rescue lay on the other side of the island's icebound and treacherous interior. And here you can see South Georgia's magnificent and permanently icebound core. Next slide, please. On the 26th of May 1916, 3 men arrived unexpectedly at the manager's villa in Stromness Whaling Station, South Georgia. So surprised at seeing 3 bearded, dishevelled and emaciated strangers, the station manager was said to have asked, "Who the hell are you?" The 3 strangers were Frank Worsley, Tom Crean and Sir Ernest Shackleton. Next slide, please. Their ability to reach the villa and the assistance of the whalers was nothing short of miraculous. Following the ordeal, Shackleton wrote, "During that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. When they discussed their experiences later, all 3 revealed that they had had the strange feeling that there had been a 4th person accompanying them on the grueling trek, and that really captured the public's imagination at the time." Next slide, please. Shackleton had left his trusted second-in-command, Frank Wild, remember the biscuit incident, in charge of the men on Elephant Island. Despite the appalling conditions, Frank Wild would roll up his sleeping bag each morning with the words, "Get your things ready, boys, the boss may come today." After a few failed attempts to reach them, the remaining crew were eventually rescued on the 30th of August. One can only imagine their feelings on seeing the boss once again. "I felt jolly near blubbing for a bit," admitted Wild, and could not speak for several minutes. This image, courtesy of South Georgia Museum, is a private diary extract from Sir James Wordie, who was the geologist and chief of scientific staff. Here's what he says about the day of rescue. "All morning, about 10 of us were kept busy shoveling snow away from the deep drifts on the north side of the hut. Knocked off at midday, and all hands went limpeting with a view to making a seal limpet hoosh." Sounds tasty. "Shortly before 1 p.m. was called away from shelling limpets, lunch being ready. Then, just as Wild was serving it out, Marston came to the door asking if we had anything to make a smoke signal, as a ship was in sight, underlined. Lunch thrown to the winds, all tumbled out of the hut anyway. There she was, what we took to be a whaler, steaming past us eastwards. The smoke signal failed, but there was no need for it, as by now her head was towards us and she had run up her flag at the mizzen." Later that day, Wordie writes, About 5 p.m, an excellent dinner was provided. Tinned peaches and white wine deserve mention. The wardroom, which I suppose normally holds 4, is quite crowded out, but dinner was successfully managed in 3 servings. Then Hussey brought in his banjo. Tobacco and cigarettes circulate like water. I doubt very much if the Chilean sailors could appreciate our concert. Their acquaintance with English is very limited. An exceedingly merry evening was spent aft, at which apparently the rescued were sole performers. Here were heard all the old favourites and the new topicale of the hut, and so till drowsiness and sheer weariness won the day. Next slide, please. This is how Stromness Whaling Station looked in 1916, with the manager's villa in white in the middle of the image. Incredibly, the villa at Stromness that Crean, Worsley and Shackleton reached still stands, but it's in imminent danger of collapse. Next slide, please. The South Georgia Heritage Trust has worked on many projects related to Shackleton over the years, but none more exciting than this one. The mission to save the villa that the 3 reached on the 20th of May 1916 to raise the alarm for the rescue of the Endurance crew. Next slide, please. The Stromness Manager's Villa is arguably the most important and famous Shackleton-related object worldwide after Endurance itself, and saving it is the natural next chapter in the remarkable story of the ship and its crew, following the incredible discovery of the wreck in this condition in 2022 by Dr. John Shears and his team. Next slide, please. The Trust has already raised $3 million in a very short time for the villa, such is the enthusiasm for this project, and we hope to send a team including expert Norwegian carpenters to Stromness next October to rescue it. The following year, the leader of the successful Endurance 22 expedition, Dr. John Shears, and the face of Endurance 22, historian Dan Snow, planned to undertake a traverse in Shackleton's footsteps right to the door of the newly stabilised villa to raise awareness for the importance of this conservation work. Next slide, please. Shackleton may not have been perfect, but he and this villa stand as emblems of the triumph of the best of human nature, where unselfishness, courage and teamwork beat the odds to save the entire Endurance crew. Ernest Shackleton earned a place in history, not through achievement and success, but in the way he dealt with adversity and roused optimism in those around him when facing the toughest of odds. Shackleton was a great motivator. He never gave any indication that they were in a seemingly hopeless situation. He led by example, weighing up the risks carefully before making a decision. He had to consider the impact of his own loss and the ship's captain, Frank Worsley, along with 4 other crew members, in making that attempt to get to South Georgia, against the gain of potentially rescuing his entire crew from almost certain death. He left behind his trusted deputy, Frank Wild, who he knew would keep the crew motivated to survive during months of severe hardships. He took with him Worsley, a professional navigator who would have the best chance of finding South Georgia. Shackleton even took with him a potential troublemaker to ease the strain of those left behind. The whole ship's crew survived because of excellent teamwork inspired by a great leader. And for me, this quote from Antarctic explorer Raymond Priestley sums it up perfectly. For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you are in a hopeless situation, when there seems no way out, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. Next slide, please. Shackleton's final expedition, the Shackleton Rowett or Quest expedition in 1921 to 1922, was intended to chart the missing gaps in the coastline of the Antarctic continent and survey forgotten or little known islands in the southern hemisphere. You can see they're kind of running out of new firsts by this point. The expedition set off from St Catherine Dock, London in 1921 aboard the ship Quest en route to Antarctica. The crow's nest of Quest now resides permanently in the crypt of All Hallows by the Tower Church, which is well worth a visit, and hopefully a few of you will be able to go and see it there. Shackleton died on board the Quest on 5th of January 1922, when the Quest was moored in the harbour of Grytviken, another of South Georgia's whaling stations. Shackleton called the Dr. Macklin in the early hours of 5th of January in the midst of a heart attack. Macklin, not for the first time, told him he would have to change his style of life. Macklin said that Shackleton replied, "You're always wanting me to give up things. What is it that I ought to give up?" A few moments later, Shackleton died, age only 47. His last diary entry aboard Quest read, "A wonderful evening. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover, gem-like, above the bay." Next slide, please. The original intention was to send Shackleton's body back to England for burial, but when his wife Emily heard the news, she decided that he should be buried at South Georgia. To the right, as you face his grave, there is a memorial stone to Shackleton's faithful lieutenant, Frank Wild, whose ashes were interred there in 2011. Next slide, please. On the back of the monumental granite headstone, there's a quote from Robert Browning, Shackleton's favourite poet. "I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for his life's set prize." The crew of Quest also erected this cross at Hope Point nearby, and the original cross is going to be on display at Discovery Point, Dundee, so do go and see it if you can. Next slide, please. Shackleton was a complex character, optimistic, ambitious, driven and determined, but perhaps it was his empathy, selflessness, storytelling ability and poetic soul that have given him almost mythological status, and one whose legacy on South Georgia, I hope you will agree, is worth saving. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Alison. That was a fascinating talk. I was sort of riveted there, thinking about Shackleton. Now, lots of questions really. So the Shackleton, as you alluded to right at the end of your talk, is extremely famous, and I'd like to sort of come back to that at the future. But I thought it might be helpful if the South Georgia Heritage Trust sort of brings to the table a lot of kudos, I think, because of its activities in ecology and environmental science. Have you got a moment just to talk a little bit about those? Because I think people might also be interested in what you've been doing down there.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I'd love to. So the trust was set up to basically preserve the heritage, the cultural heritage of the island, but also to help protect its environment. And we've worked with people all around the world, including the government of South Georgia and our US affiliate Friends of South Georgia Island, to achieve great things on the island itself. The major project that we achieved was the eradication of all of the rats and mice from the island, of which there were probably millions, we don't know the exact number. But those had been introduced by the sealers and then the whalers, and they were effectively predating defenceless native birds because, as you've seen from South Georgia's sort of terrain, it doesn't have lots of vegetation. The birds were just nesting either on the ground or in shallow burrows, and the rats and mice could very easily reach them. So the charity, which was set up in 2005, had that ambition right from the start to try and get rid of the rats and mice. But honestly, we thought it was a pipe dream because these sorts of conservation projects have really only been undertaken successfully by big government departments in the past. But we managed through a really helpful kind of conservation network to bring together a team of experts from all around the world, including New Zealand, Australia, the USA. And we, over 3 field seasons, managed to actually eradicate all of the rats and mice by baiting from a helicopter. So you spread bait a bit like fertilizer all over the island. And the rats and mice then ate that bait, which was customised for them, so it didn't impact greatly on any other wildlife on the island. And in 2018, along with the government of the island, we were delighted to announce that the island was indeed rat-free, the largest ever island eradication. So yeah, that was a fantastic achievement and has meant that Sir David Attenborough has since described the island as an ecosystem in recovery. It's also got a huge marine protected area set up by the South Georgia government, which is really helping the recovery of the marine life, and in particular whales. And some of you might have read in the news about the fantastic increase in the numbers of humpbacks, bluefin sei whales. And we want to commemorate that as a charity, but also not forget the human mistakes that were made in slaughtering so many whales, some species to near extinction. So we're creating a memorial to the whale on the island at one of the former whaling stations, Grytviken, that I mentioned in my talk. So that's just some of the work that we're doing.
So, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I thought people might be listening thinking, well, what are the chances that you're going to do anything? And the chances of, that was an amazing project. I would have given you 0 chance of eliminating all the rats. So you could, if you can do that, you can do anything. Now, lots of questions. Let's just pick the first one that happened to be here, who's from James Younger, who I think is probably Viscount Younger, given his email address, but apologies if I've ennobled you for no good reason. He asks, first question, given the remoteness and inaccessibility of South Georgia, what plans, if any, are there to install a permanent eye in the renovated house for the rest of us to see? And just while you're thinking about that one, I'll give you another one from him, which is what further plans, if any, are there to explore the endurance at the bottom of the Weddell Sea? So
okay, well, on the second one, that's sort of beyond what I'm aware of. What I do know is that the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust has put together a fantastic conservation management plan for the endurance vessel, and the strong intention is that there will be no sort of removal of artefacts. Access will be very, very strict to that vessel. We have to protect it at all costs. That's the most important thing. But I believe that there are plans, and some of the Endurance 22 team may even be involved in those, in returning and maybe doing a bit more diving, so that at least the world can see even more fantastic film and footage of the wreck. And in terms of access by the public to Stromness Manager's Villa, part of our intention when that traverse happens that I was telling you about is to actually make a documentary, and we're hoping to be able to actually film the interior as well as the newly stabilised exterior of that villa as part of that documentary. And Dan Snow is interested in being involved, so we really hope that will happen and that we manage to actually get it televised. And we've also got some 3D scans that the government took of the building, so a digital kind of virtual recreation is also on the cards.
I mean, I was on Google Maps before you're preparing for this, and enjoying wandering around with the tourists. But there isn't much to look at online, is there? Unless I've got that wrong. So it would be wonderful to have a sort of virtual way to visit without causing a lot of damage. So
that's it. So yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, South Georgia, broadband isn't isn't the greatest when you get down there. And in some ways, it's actually a good thing because it means that visitors put their phone away, apart from maybe taking some photographs. And that they're not connected to the outside world, so maybe they get a little bit more of the feel of how it must have been for those explorers a century ago. Really kind of stranded. It's really remote. It feels more like a proper journey than so many places you can get to, where you just get on a plane and back off it again. To get to South Georgia, you need to go on a ship for 4 or 5 days. And, that just adds to the thrill. And then this incredible island opens up in front of you.
And Matthew Bellhouse Moran, who is from HMS Unicorn, probably you know where that is, given your location. He asks, is the climate on South Georgia more challenging to preserve buildings than on the Antarctic mainland? Is there something about South Georgia that is particularly good or bad when it comes to conservation?
Hi, Matthew. Well, so there's both good and bad from that perspective. So the humidity is actually very low. And Matthew, as a museum person, you'll know that humidity can wreak havoc on artifacts and museum objects. But actually, we have less of an issue with that on South Georgia, running the South Georgia Museum. When it comes to buildings, of course, the wind, the weather, etc., does kind of take its toll on the buildings. But we're really lucky that we've got Norwegian involvement in the sort of stabilisation of that villa, because it was made very much to a kind of Norwegian style. And the carpenters that we've got understand heritage buildings and how it's been constructed. So we've got a lot of confidence that they will actually be able to repair it in a very sturdy way. And we're anticipating, in terms of its long-term maintenance, that every 5 years or so it might need a lick of paint, but ultimately, as long as we keep checking it and it's windproof and watertight, it should be fine for a long, long time.
Linda Howard sort of comments and questions. She says, I was lucky enough to visit South Georgia in February 23, and can confirm the wildlife is amazing. There were fur seals everywhere, she says. Are you intending to do anything to control their populations?
Well, the short answer is no, Linda. That's, you'll know from going to South Georgia that South Georgia, first and foremost, is the wildlife's home. It's not the humans' home. There's no resident population on the island. The seals were hunted from the late 18th century onwards, almost again to the point that there were none left until the industry became unsustainable, very much in the same way as whales were hunted. And the population is now recovering to its kind of natural numbers, and we shouldn't be interfering with that again, in my opinion. If we allow nature to return to the sort of ecosystem that was on the island before humans intervened, then a natural balance should happen eventually. And of course, that means that tourism is limited, but the most important thing is that the ecosystem is in recovery, that we let it do its thing, and we just enjoy it as it is rather than trying to overly control how it is.
Great. Peter Gilbert asks, he said, there were a few months ago, there was a lot of worry about the arrival of bird flu and its transfer to the seal population. How's that going?
So there's still a big unknown, to be honest, about what avian flu is going to look like next season. There were, a lot of deaths last season, both in terms of birds, but also in some ways unexpectedly, the seals were really badly impacted. And it's very distressing. There's very little that can be done about it. Everything that could be done was done. I suppose the fortunate thing is that humans don't seem to be transmitters, but that situation has been very carefully managed by the government. So we're all just crossing our fingers and toes that next season it doesn't return in another wave, and we've got over the worst of it, in which case South Georgia will be open to tourists next season.
And Alison, when I started thinking about Shackleton, I mean, there's a sort of Shackleton industry, really. There's a Shackleton whiskey, there's a Shackleton banjo, I think, beer, clothing, Shackleton Clothing Company. So there's a lot of sort of commercial interest in the story. Has that converted into funding or support for the causes that you're talking about?
Yes, well, I mean, one of the sort of obvious ways that we're getting support is actually that the South Georgia government has created a set of Shackleton stamps and first day covers, which would be a fantastic present for any Shackleton enthusiasts. And actually, the funds from that will go towards the villa work. So if anyone is interested, do get in touch, and we can contact government on your behalf, or hopefully we'll be able to sell some in our online shop. So our website is sght.org for anything like that you're interested in. But yes, we also have got obviously a lot of help from the cruise operators, and they're particularly interested in getting people down there to sort of make a toast to Shackleton. So we end up, we sell quite a lot of whiskey at the museum, and then people can go to his graveside and they can toast the boss, and that tends to be good. But it's definitely one of the reasons why this project will hopefully be a success, is that we've got lots of corporate interest in supporting it. And so, but we need more. So if there's anyone out there that would like to become involved in this next chapter of the Endurance story, do contact us.
Well, yeah, if you're listening and you're a corporate sponsor, Shackleton's values are very good corporate values, aren't they? And we all wish we had a little bit of Shackleton in us, no question about that. Nick Cheetham asks, when were the reindeer removed from South Georgia?
So the reindeer were removed as part of that rodent eradication project that I was telling you about. So basically, it was in between the first and second phase of that project. So it was around about 2012. And the reindeer were removed because they would have potentially eaten the bait that we were putting down for rats and mice. And what that would have meant was two things. First of all, the reindeer would have died a horrible death. And secondly, the rats and mice would not have had access to that bait. Now, the reindeer population in Georgia was much larger than anybody had actually thought by the time we sort of figured it out. And many of those reindeer were actually starving to death through lack of food every winter. So it was in some ways a humane decision as well, and one that the public certainly seemed to support. So we really appreciated South Georgia government's removal of those reindeer, although there are still some South Georgia reindeer left in the Falkland Islands. So they haven't been wiped out altogether.
And Matt Yu has a rather technical question to which I certainly don't know the answer, but you may. He said, when referencing endurance, it was stated it was necessary to protect the vessel. And he says, what is the difference between protection, preservation, conservation, and restoration? And how do these terms apply to the hut? Now, that might be a half-hour answer there, I don't know, but is there a difference in those terms?
Yeah, well, in terms of endurance itself, I don't think the right term is protect. So apologies if I said that. I think probably what we want to do is just keep it as much as it is as possible. So preservation would probably be the right term there. When it comes to the Stromness Managers Villa, it's a really good example to answer your question. So at this point in time, what we are doing is stabilizing it. So you could, I guess you would class that under conservation. And then once that work is done, we will then be protecting it. But we may also in future wish to restore it, which would be probably to do some work to make it more like it would have been when Shackleton Worsley Crean reached it in 1916. Now, I'm not a museum curator either, so I have to kind of plead ignorance on that, but hopefully that's a little bit of a clarification of the terms.
Yeah, it's always a delicate issue, this restoring buildings, isn't it? Because different countries and cultures have different views of what a acceptable restoration. In certain places, it's taken back to mint, and in the UK, we usually only mend the bits that are really broken, don't we? Now, Anne Strathy has, I think it's really a comment, but it's phrased as a question, which is, are those involved in eradication projects on South Georgia in contact with or collaboration with New Zealand teams and others who are working on similar eradication projects on other sub-Antarctic islands, equally successfully, from what I understand?
Yeah, so before South Georgia, the New Zealand island, Campbell Island, had been the largest eradication in the world. We would not have been able to successfully clear rats and mice from South Georgia if it hadn't been for New Zealand expertise. We had New Zealand pilots, we had New Zealand sort of team leaders, and we had the Department of Conservation from New Zealand as a kind of independent expert group who were more than generous in giving us advice. South Georgia was actually 6 times a larger area than the next biggest one, which was Campbell Island at the time. And the New Zealanders continue to do fantastic work in clearing the islands, and they really set the standard for the rest of the world. We were just a charity that was kind of borrowing knowledge from them to try and make this happen. But every single eradication that is done and every single removal of an invasive species from an island makes it easier for the next one to succeed. So this is very much passing on the knowledge in a chain to handing over to the next group of conservationists.
Great. Now, we're nearly at the end of our session, I'm sorry to say, but I should just point out that there are a number of people in the Q&A who are, I was going to say, boasting about having visited South Georgia. I mean, that's the wrong word, isn't it? They're pleased that they went, and there were people like Nick Cheetham, who was based there at the British Army garrison, had to kill a few deer, he says. Who else was claiming? It was it Anne? Linda, wasn't it, who said that she'd talking about seals and so on. So there's a collection of people who are among a very rare set who've actually visited. Do you get a passport stamp if you go? Is there any?
You do, yes. You get a very special passport stamp. I think it features a penguin from memory. So yeah, no, I mean,
right.
the whole experience is just so incredible. And although for some people it is just the trip of a lifetime, and they have to save up for a long time to go, there's also many visitors that come back time and time again because they've just fallen in love with the place.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. It's a sort of Antarctic hotspot of people. It's a place people really want to go. Now, Anne, wonderful talk. Hope people found it useful. We are a bit out of time, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen. So just a quick look at some of the forthcoming lectures, which you can find out about on the Gresham Society website, amongst other places. But here they are, the ones that are coming to hit us. As usual with this series, they're wildly diverse in their interests, from green shipping through to playing cards. That's some breadth, isn't it? Thank yous. Right. First, thank you to the audience, without whom we have no questions. So I'm very grateful for your questions and commentary, which makes the session as far as we're concerned. Obviously, biggest thank you to Alison for preparing this and carrying on the good works, raising money and generally doing wonderful things. That's fantastic. Just a couple of observations. These talks are recorded and you can find them on our YouTube channel in case you would like to revisit anything. If you enjoyed this sort of thing, then you might enjoy the lectures by Gresham College, which are a free set of academic lectures paid for by the will of Sir Thomas Gresham in the City of London, and they have a base also in the city. Final thanks to Zien, who have been looking after all of these lectures and produce all of the expertise. With that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.